I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey lurkers, welcome to this week's episode. This week we're going to be heading to the Gettysburg battlefield to hear about some of the creepiness that goes on there. Before we get started, I want to mention that the Gettysburg National Battlefield is now closed each day at sunset. That doesn't mean you can't encounter strange paranormal things, it just means you can't do it at night. You'll get fined, and you'll give ghost hunters a bad name. Just don't even bother to try. Also, I want to mention that two popular areas of the battlefield, both of which will be mentioned in this episode, are currently closed for renovation. Devil's Den and Little Round Top are both getting renovated to fix some erosion issues, and I think they're working on parking issues at Little Round Top and making the pathways a little bit better. So if you're planning a visit, you might want to wait. Little Round Top is going to be closed for the next 18 months, so a year and a half. So just a heads up in case you're considering it. We've already covered some of the stories from Gettysburg in a couple of other episodes. I talked about some personal experiences from Gettysburg in episode 16, which was about my son seeing dead people. And then again in episode 18 about shadow people. And both of those episodes had mention of some Gettysburg stories in them. And then episode 21 was all about Gettysburg. So if you're interested in the topic, go back and check those out, give those a listen for some additional stories. In this episode, I'll share some of my personal stories, some stories other people told me, and also some of the more popular stories from the area. For starters, in case anyone is not familiar with the history of Gettysburg, it is a town located in south central Pennsylvania on the east coast of the United States. And July 1st through 3rd in 1863, Gettysburg was the scene of a battle during the Civil War between the Union and the Confederates. It is considered the bloodiest single battle of the Civil War. General Robert E. Lee intended to take his Confederates and invade the North, hoping to force a Union surrender to negotiate an end to the war. Instead, Lee's army was defeated, and they returned to the South. The war would last another 2 years. Gettysburg is said to be a turning point in the war. The Gettysburg battlefield was my personal introduction to ghost hunting. When I started doing real investigations, I started at Gettysburg. It was only minutes from my house, about 15 to 20 minutes from my house, which made it convenient, and back then it was actually open until 10 p.m. On one of my first trips to the battlefield, I went with my cousin, who I've mentioned before. It's important to note here, I am pretty certain she has a minor in photography. I think she actually holds a degree in photography. If not, I know she at the very least took photography classes. She's knowledgeable about cameras and photography is basically the point that I'm getting at. She knows cameras. She had a very nice camera with her the night that we went out. We ended up going to the area known as the Triangular Field. This is an area that I've mentioned before, I believe in episode 21. If you're standing at the top of Devil's Den, looking at Little Round Top, the Triangular Field would be behind you, across the road. During the battle, it was heavily contested, and it was eventually controlled by the Confederates. That would have been during the second day of battle on July 2nd, in case you're wondering. It was one of my favorite places on the battlefield, when it still had trees along the lower edge. the park began cutting trees to return the park to resemble what it looked like during the battle. I can see the draw of that, but personally, I'm not impressed. I would rather have the trees. I think Gettysburg used to be a very pretty battlefield park because of the trees that it had, and now it doesn't have as many trees, and it just kind of looks barren in my mind. Anyway, this one Saturday night in the 1990s, so decades ago, Kelly and I are checking things out in the triangular field. I honestly think this was one of our first official investigations. We're in the triangular field and we come across this group of people who are ghost hunting. So of course we kind of follow along with them, but also trying to pretend we're not following along with them. You know, trying to be slick about eavesdropping, wanting to hear what they're talking about and see what they're doing. Kelly is using her really nice camera, taking photos, when it decides to take a crap. It stops working. So she's fiddling with her camera, trying to figure out what's wrong with it. She had just charged the batteries and she couldn't figure out what the problem was since it had just been working a few moments before. At this point, we get the group's attention because they're interested in what's going on with us. About this time, my little film camera, not so nice, just a cheap film camera, stops working. The batteries have no power, though I had literally just put them in the camera straight from the brand new package. So finally we decide, that's it, we're going to call it a night. We obviously can't do anything else because our equipment isn't working, and we get ready to head out of the field. And one of the men in the group comes over to talk to us to see what exactly was going on. We explained that Kelly's nice camera stopped working, mine was acting like the batteries were dead, we were just having trouble. And he explained that cameras were known to stop working or otherwise malfunction in the triangular field. At this point, Kelly and I decide to walk back to the car. So we start heading back to the car. The group is now following behind us, and when we reached the car, we tried the cameras again, and both of them worked perfectly without any issue. Malfunctioning cameras are a common occurrence in the triangular field, and most often it's blamed on a Civil War photographer. The photographer used the body of a Confederate soldier to stage photos. The body was dragged around and propped up to make for a better photo op. I'm talking about the famous Devil's Den sharpshooter photo. It was staged. The man in the photo was actually killed in the area behind where that photo was taken. He was killed in the triangular field. I'll make sure that I post that photo on social media so that you can see that. Local news station camera crews aren't even exempt from the camera problems in the triangular field. While filming a segment about the ghosts of Gettysburg for a Halloween, one camera crew's expensive camera began having all sorts of problems. The camera had a display that would show a numbered code that corresponded with a code in the manual that explained the error that was going on. Typically, it would show one code at a time, but on this day it kept flashing different numbers, some that had no corresponding code at all in the manual. Of course, once they left the triangular field, the camera worked just fine. So we're going to be staying in the area of Devil's Den for a little bit, as I have a couple of other experiences of my own to share from this location. First, though, I want to point out that when you're out investigating the paranormal, do not assume that you're going to see something. So I'm going to apologize here. I'm going to give you a little Ghost Hunting 101. I'm going to give you a little bit of a lesson. Seeing a full-bodied apparition is the least likely thing to have happen on an investigation. Honestly, in 30 years, it's only happened to me a handful of times. And I'm not counting shadow people because I think they're kind of their own thing. I don't know what they are, maybe ghosts, maybe not, I don't know. But your most common paranormal occurrence will actually come from your sense of smell. I personally think this is because the sense of smell is linked to memory. And if you don't believe me, there is a Harvard study about this, not ghosts, but about the sense of smell being linked with memory. The olfactory or smell sense is linked directly to your amygdala and hippocampus, which both involve memory and emotion. So that's why when you smell a distinct smell, it will immediately take you back to a memory. That's why. And I think somewhere along the lines, that's why smell is the number one thing you have happen in as far as paranormal experience. So in Gettysburg, it's not uncommon to get a quick whiff of something that you shouldn't be smelling, like pipe tobacco, rose or peppermint oil. Both of those were used by residents to mask the smell of rotting bodies after the battle. The smell of rotting bodies, horses, leather, perfume, etc. Personally, I've smelled most of these scents except the peppermint oil. I can't say I've come across that specific one, but I do regularly smell pipe tobacco. In fact, on an afternoon walk just recently, just a few weeks ago, near Spangler Spring, I caught a whiff of the pipe tobacco. And I was not alone in smelling it. My daughter smelled it. My brother smelled it. I've also smelled the distinct odor of rotting flesh. That's something that you don't forget. Burned cordite, which is gunpowder. The smell of horses and leather. And perfume. The next sense I'd say is the most common, would be auditory or your sense of hearing. Following that would be the sense of touch, and finally, seeing something. I didn't forget the sense of taste. That's considered tied in with the sense of smell. I don't really know about you, but I haven't licked any ghosts, nor do I want to or plan to. So just an FYI, if there are any of the ghosts that currently live in my house are listening, this is not a challenge. I do not want to lick you. Really, that would not be enjoyable for either one of us. To get back to Devil's Den, here I've encountered a couple of odd happenings involving hearing something, which was the whole point in that whole lecture about your senses and the paranormal. So one evening, I distinctly heard the sound of a horse galloping along the road. If you're familiar with the area, it was coming from the direction of where Wheatfield Road and Crawford Road meet, where you turn to come down to the den, and it was headed in my direction. It was coming down towards Devil's Den. So I stepped aside, a little perplexed, because I wasn't sure why somebody would be riding a horse that fast on a paved road. And I stood there and waited for the horse and rider, or possibly just the horse, because I was thinking, there are farms in the area. Maybe a horse did get out and took off, and that's why it's running, because I didn't think a rider would make a horse run on pavement that fast. But there are people who would not consider the health of the horse. Who knows? Anyway, I digress. So I'm standing there waiting for this horse and rider to appear and show itself as it drew near. The noise grew louder, and just as it got to the point where I should be able to see it, the noise stopped. I stepped into the road to look, and there was absolutely nothing there. There was no horse anywhere in the area, and there was no place for the horse to go. During another investigation, the group I was with had been checking out the triangular field in Devil's Den, and they decided that they were going to head to Little Round Top to see what might be happening up there. It was a slow ghost night, if I recall, and that made me slightly braver than usual. I'm not saying that I'm brave by any stretch of the imagination, just to clarify. I'm the kind of person who can go at 11:30 at night to an unsafe location, specifically an insane asylum, and take photos and recordings, and then go home to my grandmother's house and be afraid to sleep in the upstairs bedroom. I'm not brave. So on this night, I decided it was nice out, and I wanted to walk from the top of Devil's Den over to Little Round Top. There's a road that heads up that way, so it's not really a difficult walk at all. So everyone else loads up in their vehicles and heads out. Now, for them to reach Little Round Top by car, they must follow the road around because it's one way, and basically come back around to the den to pick up the road to head up to Little Round Top. And my point in saying that is I was going to be alone. Like, totally alone. And out of sight. Like, they aren't going to be driving up to the top of Little Round Top and able to look back and see me, because they have to go way out of the way to make it back around. So they all leave, and I was sitting there enjoying the quiet evening. It was just starting to get dark out. It was kind of a little bit past sunset, so the sun was down, but there was still light. It's, getting dark, so I decide it's time to head up to Little Round Top before it was completely dark. So I start walking down the road from the top of Devil's Den down to the parking area, when I start hearing the distinct sound of hobnails on the pavement. Hobnails are short nails with a thick head that are nailed into the bottom of a shoe and are used to prolong the life of the shoe's sole. It's not just one or two nails in the shoe, but it's several, and they make a distinct clicking noise on hard surfaces like pavement. I was a little unnerved hearing this because my first thought was that someone was there with me, that there was some reenactor that was there, and that I didn't know who it was, and I was completely alone, and since this is before cell phones, I had no way to call anybody for help. As I've mentioned before, the living scares me far more than the dead. So I duck off the road and start formulating a plan about how I'm going to take off through the boulders to get back to the parking area quicker. And I stood there and waited and listened as the sound grew closer. And as it approached and went past where I was, there was absolutely no one on the road. Not a single soul. So at this point, I'm starting to really think my idea of being brave and walking alone was seriously stupid. I continued my walk down to the parking area. I'm really trying to walk quickly and get up to the top of Little Round Top to meet up with my group. I pretty much was done admiring the night. I just needed to get back with everybody. As I'm walking past the parking spaces, and near the road that runs between the woods and the slope of Little Round Top, I catch a weird light out of the corner of my eye. I turn and see an area of the woods glowing in a bluish light. And as I watch, two figures materialize within the light. A woman in period dress and a man in a Civil War uniform. I stood there in complete awe and disbelief for a moment, and the figures began moving towards me. It seemed as though both figures were aware of my presence, as if they could actually see me and were coming over to where I was. I didn't wait around, and instead I took off not up the road, because that ran a little too close to where these entities were, but I actually went up the face of Little Round Top. It's not a gentle rolling hill. It's steep in areas, and afterwards I commented and said, I have no idea how men tried to do this in wool uniforms. I was out of breath and exhausted, but I was not going on the road. As I made my way up Little Round Top, I didn't slow down, I didn't look behind me, I just went up the slope as fast as I absolutely could. Once at the top and able to tell my story, the group that I had been with looked down to the area of the Devil's Den and the parking lot, and there was nothing there, of course. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person to have encountered these specific spirits. There's a story about a group of Gettysburg college students who took a Ouija board to Devil's Den to have some fun. During their Ouija session, they were getting some responses and had a conversation with a Union soldier named Eric, who had a female companion with him. Finally, the students needed to leave as it was getting close to the 10 p.m. closing time, but the guy with the Ouija board half-jokingly told the entity he was speaking to meet them before they left. Not a good idea. Just saying, not cool. It's one thing to say it when you don't have a Ouija board. Not something that I would do. I've never used a Ouija board. I've always been warned strongly about not using them. And I'm curious about using one, but it's like these people who had experience, and I'm not talking about like peers. These are not people who were my age. I'm talking older people. One of them was a psychic. Don't use it. So I won't because I'm terrified. But it's like you want to because you want to say that you did. Anyway, I'm like getting way off topic tonight. So he tells this entity, hey, meet up with us before we go. So the group of students starts walking down the steps to the parking lot when they heard one of the girls ahead scream and the guy who had invited the spirits to join them yell out, "Oh my God." There in the woods on the other side of Plum Run, there at the parking lot, was a man in Union uniform. The man seemed to glow with a bluish-gray light. And there next to him was another figure, that of a woman in Civil War period clothing. The ghostly couple began moving towards the cars. The students made a mad dash for their vehicles, hoping to reach them before the eerie couple did. They made it to the cars, got in, and took off out of Devil's Den. When one of them looked back behind them, he saw a bluish light fading away into the woods. I can tell you I have never opted to walk around the battlefield at night alone again. And even during the daytime, I usually stick to places where other people are there, or I've had a dog with me. Another popular story about some of the ghosts of Gettysburg involves some foreign dignitaries who were visiting the battlefield. They were standing on Little Round Top admiring the view when they noticed a large group of reenactors in the valley below. This regiment of men in Civil War uniform performed maneuvers with perfect precision and were so impressive the dignitaries returned to the visitor center to thank the superintendent for providing such an excellent and authentic reenactment. The superintendent was puzzled, as he hadn't planned anything for the dignitaries, and further, there were no groups of reenactors in the park at all that day. Just so you know, in order to have a group on the park property, you have to fill out a permit. Several years ago, I received an email from a gentleman who was visiting the park with his wife. They had been checking out an area of the battlefield. He never gave me a specific location. When he noticed a group of reenactors drilling in the field behind him. By drilling, I mean they were doing maneuvers. They were practicing, doing drills. He watched them for a moment, smiling, as he had been a reenactor himself when he was younger. He turned away to get his wife's attention, to show her, but when they both turned around to look, the group of reenactors were gone. There was nowhere they could have disappeared to, and there were no cars in the parking area or roads near the field where the men were going through their paces. They just simply vanished. For our final couple stories, we're going to head over to an area of the battlefield known as East Cavalry Field, located east of town, and the scene of a cavalry battle that included Union General George Custer, which this was prior to his last stand, and Confederate General Jeb Stuart. It ended in a Union victory. A woman shared a story with me years ago about something that happened to her father when he was parked at the small parking lot there on East Cavalry Field. While he was sitting in his minivan, he began hearing the sounds of battle. The sounds grew louder until suddenly, through his windshield, he sees that he's smack in the middle of a cavalry attack. He watched, panicked, unable to move to start the vehicle or to take his eyes away, and then suddenly, as quickly as it started, it disappeared and the evening grew quiet. It was as if this man had somehow stepped back in time, like some kind of time shift occurred. You might assume that this sort of thing is relatively unheard of, except it's not, at least not in Gettysburg. There's a well-known story from the Gettysburg College about two administrators who took the elevator to the basement of Pennsylvania Hall. When the elevator doors opened, there before them was a gruesome scene. Wounded soldiers being treated and the doctor there covered in blood. and the doctor turned and he looked right at the two individuals and he beckoned them to come and help. Frantically, they began hitting the closed door button. When the doors closed and then reopened, there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The hospital scene was gone. It was like an elevator ride to another time. This story happened in the 1980s. In 2000-something, a man working as a secretary took the same elevator down to the basement of the same building. When the doors opened, there before him was a scene from a Civil War hospital, with lights, wounded soldiers, and doctors and nurses. Stunned, he stared as the doors eventually closed. He stood there a moment, then pressed the open button, and when the doors opened, there was nothing there, just the regular basement. Pennsylvania Hall is the oldest building on campus and was built in 1832. During the Battle of Gettysburg, it served as a hospital and a morgue. It's said that the hospital was gruesome, with many soldiers being operated on without any kind of anesthesia. Imagine having your leg or arm amputated and being completely awake. If you're shopping for a college and looking for a little paranormal fun, Gettysburg College is ranked as the third most haunted college campus. There's another instance of some kind of time warp on the battlefield, only this one took place in the area of Pickett's Charge. A woman was walking down the path from the Virginia Monument with her young daughter in a stroller. When they got to the field at the end of the path, she was suddenly surrounded by men and the sounds of war. It lasted only seconds, but that was long enough. She took off at a run back to the safety of her car. So if you're out and about in Gettysburg, not only do you need to be aware of smells and spirits, you also have to watch for shifts in time. You wouldn't want to get stuck in 1863. I do have a couple of EVPs to play for you from investigations around the battlefield. So the first one that I'm going to play, I'll go ahead and play it for you now. So here's that. So when we played this back, we actually thought this said ready, aim, fire. And we thought that because it was actually, the recorder was sitting on top of a cannon and we walked away from it and it was sitting there on its own. And when we played it back, that's what it sounded like. So I'm going to play it one more time for you. And then this next one, I'm going to go ahead and play that for you now. Actually, recently when I was listening through these, I thought this one said something about keep moving. Like somebody was telling somebody to, keep marching, keep moving along. So let me play that for you again. That's going to do it for this episode. As always, you can find us wherever you find your other favorite podcast or at lurkpodcast.com, where we have all of our episodes as well as social media links. Take a moment to like or follow us on one of our socials. If you have Facebook, we also have a Facebook group, and I sometimes put polls or ask for suggestions on topics. Remember, the Whitehall, New York Sasquatch Festival is happening September 24th. Lurk will be there with some merch. It's definitely worth a trip if you're looking for something to do. Make sure you stop by and say hey, grab a shirt. Also, if you have a story about an after-death communication you've experienced, please consider sharing it with me for a future episode. You can email me at lurkpodcast@yahoo.com or send a DM through social media. And until next time, keep lurking.